co-hosts for this webinar this morning or afternoon. I don't even know what time I'm in. We're in weird times. So maybe I'll let my other two co-presenters introduce themselves. Selina, you want to go first?
Hi, my name's Selina Idlas. I work for the Centre for Teaching and Learning, and I'm the OnQ educational technologist.
And Andy Legge, also an educational developer in the Center for Teaching and Learning.
All right, so we are also hoping to be joined today later on by CUFA President Elizabeth Hanson. She was in another meeting earlier, but she's hoping to pop in as soon as she's able. So that'll be a nice complement to what we're able to provide, is to have the CUFA perspective as well. Before we dive into the content for today, I always start my face-to-face workshops at the CTL with a land acknowledgement. And I've been thinking in this interesting new virtual reality, what it means to give a land acknowledgement in a virtual space. And for me, I think what it means a lot of the time now is just recognizing that I'm still in a place. For me, personally, my home where I am right now is out on Bath Road in Amherstview. And so I know that that territory that I'm standing or sitting on right now is still the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, just as Queen's University is also situated on those lands. And I think I also kind of think about, what does that really mean in terms of my personal history and the fact that my family is now supposedly owners of this property or owners of this land, and how does that put me and my family in relation to the history and reality of Indigenous presence on this land. So that's one thing that I feel actually fortunate to have to think about, because I am working from home and making these land acknowledgements now in my home space. I don't have to treat it as a work-related thing only. It's become more and more a part of my personal life as well. So in terms of how this session is running, you may actually see up in the corner that we are recording this first portion of the webinar. We're going to just record our presentation component, and then when we move to the Q&A, we'll stop the recording. We'll have some note takers keeping track of how the conversation goes, so that when our hope is by the end of the day tomorrow to turn this into a web resource that will include the recording of the first portion, plus all our slides, plus prose of the information we share, and then anything that comes up in the Q&A that we haven't already covered. So we'll make sure that link is widely available. In terms of our format, we are hoping to have about 20 minutes to talk to you or talk at you about various features of feedback. I'm going to talk more about sort of general principles of feedback. Selina is going to walk you through how to set up a survey in OnQ. And then Andy's going to wrap up with talking about what you can do with the information that you might gather. So we'll do those kind of three components relatively quickly, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A after that. Co-presenters, anything I've forgotten or anything you want to add before we dive in? Okay, cool. So I'm going to share my screen with you now so that you can see my slides. And I will minimize all these beautiful faces. There we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, we've got this 20 minutes, and then we're moving into a 40-minute Q&A. And as a kind of second layer of land acknowledgement, I recognize we are now in spring, so I've decided to thematize my pictures by having spring-related things. So you may notice some of those coming through. So the very first thing we want to do is really start with a note of caution that you have probably heard already that the USATs, the University Survey of Student Assessment of Teaching, have been canceled for this semester officially from the Provost's office, and those USATs are the only official institutional evaluation of teaching. So any feedback on teaching that you collect beyond a USAT must still follow the rules of the Queen's CUFA collective agreement. So that's the agreement between Queen's University and the Queen's University Faculty Association. And the most specific things to pay attention to here are the articles within the collective agreement dealing with the members' course survey. So that's Article 29.4, which says that in order to improve course design or teaching, a member may conduct a written survey, but that you have to carry out that survey in a way that prevents any confusion with the official USAT. And that similarly, any surveys that individuals choose to conduct are not replacements for the USAT. They're not in, compared to the USAT in any sort of way. So what does that mean in terms of what you should actually do with these surveys? Well, it means that you cannot use the same or similar questions to those on the USAT or QSAT. If for any of you who have been thinking about doing a pilot with the new survey that's being considered. So that's really critical, that you're very clear with your students this is not a replacement for the USAT, and that you're not using questions that are the same or similar to the USAT. It's important to maintain anonymity among survey participants, and also to make that participation optional. So there shouldn't be any grade weighting attached or any other required component. This is a completely optional participation from students. And that students also have to consent to participate and have their comments shared. And that can be as simple as having an opening statement in your survey that might say something like, by completing this survey, you consent to your anonymous answers being shared by the instructor as part of materials documenting their teaching. So it doesn't have to be a separate question necessarily, it's just an implied consent through the survey itself. But you do need to make that very clear and explicit with students. So those cautions aside, or keeping those cautions in mind, I should say, I think it's important also to take a step back and say, well, why would you collect this feedback at all? So when you're collecting formative feedback on your teaching, that can mean, so that's feedback that you're using to improve or to critically evaluate your own in teaching. And it's important, I think, as in any profession and professional learning, to engage in some critical reflection on what you've been doing, what you might do in future. It's just generally considered to be a part of good teaching practice. You might also be interested in thinking about the course that you're currently running, or that for future course offerings, to think about what kind of adjustments do you need to make to the course design. What are students responding to well? What are they finding isn't really working for them in terms of the course design, so that you can strategize either for the course you're running in the moment or in the future. And then you can also use this as one of many pieces of teaching effectiveness, an evidence-based approach to teaching. These sort of formative feedback tools can give you some ideas and demonstrate to others the kinds of things that make you an effective teacher. When you're thinking about asking students to give you feedback, you want to come up with ways that will prompt them to give you good feedback. And that may seem like, well, of course we need to do that now because students now think my course was terrible because the last 2 weeks were done in a haphazard remote manner. But actually this is a point that's true anytime you ask students to give you feedback, just as when you ask students to do a peer review activity, or when you yourself are giving feedback to your students, you want to figure out what does good feedback look like. So when you're talking with your students about getting good feedback, you want to first of all assert that it's important to you to receive good feedback. I think often students see course evaluation surveys as a kind of rote exercise, and they don't realize that actually this is valuable to a professor or an instructor. So telling them that it's valuable can often mean that you get better quality feedback. Similarly, you can prompt students and remind them to consider the course as a whole, not just the last few classes. You might remind them of the learning outcomes for the entire course, direct their attention back to the syllabus or to the course outline, remind them of the course timeline in terms of its content, assessments, instructional activities, doing things that help them reflect over the whole course rather than just the last few classes. You might model effective feedback either in the way that you yourself give feedback to your students, or by giving them samples of the style of feedback you find helpful. What does constructive feedback look like to you? What kinds of comments are meaningful to you? Sharing those kinds of things with students in advance can help them to provide that sort of feedback for you. And finally, I think it's important to just be aware that results that you might get can be biased. I think that you can be transparent about that with your students, to say that we all have implicit biases that impact how we understand things, or you can just keep that in mind when you're responding and reading your feedback, that there is certainly research out there that talks about different biases that students may hold when they're talking about the kind of teaching that they've encountered or experienced, and the kinds of course design that they've had to go through as a student. Again, some practical logistics. I'm coming back to this again because I think it's really important to emphasize this wholeheartedly and throughout this presentation, that we're talking about something that's not a replacement for the USAT, that can't in any way be similar to the USAT. And that when you're thinking about now, how am I actually going to design a survey that is going to be delivered to my students. Now, you might be saying, okay, well, if I can't use the USAC questions, if it can't be similar to the USAC questions, then what can I do? And I think here you want to really think about what are useful and specific questions that apply to you in your teaching style and in your specific course. So I think generally we would recommend to think about maybe some of the values that you emphasize in your teaching philosophy statement, if you have one, or some of the things that you come back to again and again in terms of instructional strategies. Maybe there's something specific about the course that was new this year that you're really interested in hearing how students responded to that particular element, or a particular unit or some sort of module where you did something different that you really want to know more about. And you might also consider having questions that are a combination of scale type questions where you have a scale of 1 to 5 and statements where students agree or disagree along that scale. So what are often called Likert questions. Or you could also include some open-ended text responses. A question that asks about strengths of your teaching style, for instance, or things that help students learn in the course. Really trying to emphasize something specific to you and things that you really want some feedback on or that you want to learn about. In terms of taking steps to encourage a good response rate, I think you need to give students sufficient time to complete the feedback. Ideally, in a perfect world, you'd be able to dedicate class or meeting time to allow students to complete the survey. I don't think that's going to necessarily happen in the current climate, but giving them sufficient time is really important. And I think I've heard a lot of questions from instructors, well, we're already at April 2nd, is this really going to be useful and valuable at all? I think students are still happy to reflect and respond and give their feedback on teaching and on a course, as long as you go back to some of those principles about making it valuable and telling students how valuable it is. So I think there is still time to get a good response rate. I don't think we're out of that window just yet. Okay, so that's my portion. I will stop sharing my screen and I'll turn it over to Selina now. And I know I'm just seeing the questions now because I couldn't see them while I was screen sharing. I realize a lot of this went by very quickly, and we will be posting this later and having all of those articles linked, so we can certainly show those again later on.
Hi everybody. So I'm going to quickly go through how you would set up your survey in OnQ. For those of you who have used the quiz tool, the survey tool is a very similar tool in that you have a question library for the questions and then you add them into your survey. The survey tool is found under the assessment tab. If you can't see the survey tool, it means it's not been switched on in your course. And in that case, you need to go to the course admin and down to tools at the bottom. Scroll down until you find the survey tool. And you just need to switch it on. So switch it on so you get the nice blue check mark. So in terms of building your survey, you're just going to go in, first of all, and build your questions through the question library. And as Robin was mentioning, you can create Likert questions, you can create written response questions. I'll just show you one of the questions. Let's go down. Where is it? I can't see Likert. Where are you? Okay, let's do this one, written response. Okay. So you can basically build your question, quite straightforward. You put your question text in and then you can decide how big you want the response box and just save it. Once you have built all your questions, oh, here's a Likert one. I'll just show you what that looks like. If we scroll down, you can see there's different scales you can use. You can use a 1 to 5 scale. You can use an agreement scale where it goes from disagree to agree. So there's lots of different options there. So the first thing to do, build your questions in the question library and then create your survey. Use the blue new survey button. Give your survey a name. I'm just going to call it. Okay, this is the important one right here, the anonymous. It must be anonymous, so you must make sure that box is checked. Once it's checked, there's no way for you to go back and ever switch on the names again. So it remains anonymous. You can then add your questions in, okay? Clicking the Add Edit Questions button. Locate your questions in the question library by importing, select them, and add them in. Okay, once you have added them in, I need the button right on the right-hand side. Okay. You can specify how many questions per page. There's lots of details like that. You can put a description in, so welcome, introducing them to the survey, and you can also put a submission message in that will appear to them after they've completed the survey. And then there's normal restrictions apply, much like the quiz tool, where you can have start and end dates, specify attempts, etc. Once you've created your survey, you may want to add it into the content so that it's easy to find by creating a module. Actually, you can see this one here. It's already been created, course feedback module, and just adding in your survey as an existing activity. Once your students have taken the survey, you're then going to want to create a report so that you can collate the results. To create a report, it's in the edit survey, and you can just create report setup and add a report. Now, the key with reports is you have to specify who you want to release a report to. So in most cases, you are going to be the primary instructor or the instructor in the course, unless you're an admin and you're going to create the report for a faculty member. You can select different types of reports. You can show aggregate data. You want to show text responses if you've got written answer questions in there. Or you can produce a report on individual attempts. You can have as many different types of reports as you want. You can specify to release immediately, and then you select the role you want to release the report to. So in this case, if you're the instructor in the course, you would select primary instructor. If you're an admin and you know which role you have, for example, I know that I'm an administrator in the course, and I want to see the report, I have to release it to myself also. In fact, I may even be to run the report. On the main survey page, you click the black arrow and you click reports, and then you would see the report there. By clicking it, you then have an option to generate a CSV file, generate Excel, or generate HTML to see the results. Usually CSV or Excel is going to be your best option because then you can manipulate the data. So my colleague Carolyn has created 2 videos on creating a survey and on generating reports that are available on the CTL website, on our YouTube channel, and also on our remote instruction page. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy now. Andy Leger. Stop sharing.
All right. So thanks, Selina. And Andy, are you going to take over now and you can talk about teaching dossiers? And I am also trying to keep up with all the questions coming through on the chat box. I recognize just before Andy dives in that there are a lot of questions about how similar to the USAT can we be? Why can't we be more similar? And I think, I mean, it does come back to the collective agreement and being really careful about not wanting to present data that has not been approved for evaluation, for promotion, for tenure, for reappointment. And I know that there's a lot of anxiety that I want to acknowledge around how can we make up questions that aren't the USAT questions, but that do the same thing as the USAT, but that aren't, and or how can I be reappointed if I don't have this documentation? And I know that those are conversations that are going on between CUFA and the Queen's administration. They're also happening among departments and department chairs. And those are certainly questions that you can ask of your own department head or faculty association representatives, as well as to us. Andy?
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. All right. I hope everybody can see that. I'm assuming you can. Again, the primary goal of what we're trying to propose to you is to get some feedback on your course. We know it's not USAT-like. We've been instructed to help you develop it in such a way that it's not. So it is formative feedback. So what I'm going to walk through now is what you can do with that. So once you have decided on what questions you want that are specific to your course, that will help you understand elements of your course and your teaching styles, there are things that you can do with it that can help sort of be shared with others to document what you've done. So bringing it back then to that article, I know we went through it quickly. This is a very specific article in the Clicker Agreement about this survey we're talking about, a members course survey. Different than USAT, very specific. It's a survey that you put together yourself. And it very clearly says that it cannot be carried out in any way that is confused with USAT, first of all. That being said, the member, you, the instructor, can submit this particular survey and its data as long as you make it clear how you did it and what instructions and what the results were. So you're welcome to conduct a survey and then submit it as part of your package for evaluation of teaching. So if I go further, one way you could do that is to submit the entire thing in and itself and say, this is a survey I did, these are the results. The other way to do that is to include the data that you collect through this particular mechanism in your teaching dossier. And if you look at element E here, it says very specifically that you're allowed to, in addition to having your USAT data, have the members survey data included. So what I'm going to do now is sort of talk through a little bit about how you might do that in your teaching dossier and what that could look like. So if you're not familiar with the teaching dossier, it is a living document. It's a document that you have a right to submit for an evaluation purposes of your teaching. It has certain elements. It's a document that's not unlike a CV, but it's a CV around or a document around your teaching specifically. Within the document yourself, you can see certain categories here, and I'm not going to go into great detail about the teaching dossier. If you want more help on that, there's a link below, and we would be more than happy to talk to you about that another time. But you may want to consider putting the data you collect from your course member survey in the evidence of teaching effectiveness section of your teaching dossier specifically. So here's an example of a section of a dossier from the evidence of teaching effectiveness. This is someone who's allowed me to use it. So this one is about course evaluations, and it's very specific how one might want to put together the data they get from USATs. So it says course evaluations, talks about the course, and then there's this descriptor up here at the top. The descriptor is very clear that this data comes from the USAT, and it gives what USAT is, as well as the Likert and the range. You can then promote and present some of the data that you want to that you've extracted from your USAT, comments from students as well. So that's an example how we've been encouraging faculty members to think about their USAT data in a teaching dossier. So then to move on, what you may want to do with your course survey is in the same sections, very specifically point out that it is the instructor's course survey. Make it clear that this is not USAT. Again, you might have the course, but then to follow is a very clear descriptor for the reader that this comes from something that you've put together. And in this case, it's an on-cue survey, which we're suggesting to you. Because what's asked in that particular collective agreement is you give all the details around the tool itself and how it was administered and how the data was collected. So this type of descriptor here might be something that would be clear enough to the reader that this is not USAT, that the responses are voluntary, anonymous. Then see the appendix for the entire tool and all the responses. And again, you could then pull from it data specifically from questions that happen to be Likert, if you choose to do those, and then representative comments that you could pull out from the questions, that perhaps the open-ended questions, and or you could qualify and put the questions underneath there and pull out a few comments with the questions specifically. And then finally, I think it would be prudent in this case to have a response to the comments or your plans for the improvement, because again, we're demonstrating that this is a formative feedback thing. This is something to help you develop your course. So what did you learn from this particular survey tool that you put into place? So this is how we're suggesting to differentiate it, so it's clear it's not USAT. Make it clear it came from you. Make it clear that that these are questions about this one course and what you've learned about this one course. So in terms of us going forward, and before I pass it over to Robin for questions, we're happy to obviously consult with anybody about these questions, whether it be the collective agreement, whether it be the teaching dossiers. And as Selina's already suggested, that there will be the videos put up of this webinar, as well as the how-to videos on the website. So I'll stop sharing and I'll give it back to Robin.
All right, sorry, I was typing something and I've completely misspelled unprecedented, which you can all take a look at later. So I think just having been monitoring the chat over the last 10 or so minutes, I'm seeing a lot of questions emerging around reappointment and tenure and appointment of contingent faculty or teaching fellows. And as far as I know, and Andy, feel free to chime in if you've heard anything else, I believe that the Queen's administration is still having conversations about what that's going to look like and has not yet reached a decision. Andy, have you heard anything different there?
I don't know one way or the other, to be honest with you, where the questions may be, or the negotiations between what's going to be viable and what's not going to be viable. There was the memo that came out from the Provost office that does make mention of what would be used and what wouldn't be used, with a lot of obviously flexibility around this particular term.
Right, yeah, so I think those questions are still kind of unfolding and ongoing. Sandra, if you could turn off the recording now, since we're into the